just going to simply initially introduce, because the order of speaking will be Zenji, and then we'll have Shawn, Reverend Shawn Newton, Leonard Swartz, Charles Fensham, and then, Zenji El-Farouk, Reverend Imam El-Farouk, and Reverend Shawn Newton, and Leonard Swartz, and then Reverend Dr. Charles Fensham. Let me read the acknowledgement of the land. As we gather this evening, we acknowledge that we are in the traditional home of the Wendat, the Tinanate, also known as the Batoon, and the First Nations collectively known as the Neutrals. We also gather upon the current home of the Mississaugas over generations. This territory has become home to many First Nations, Métis, Inuit, settler, and immigrant peoples. We strive to seek justice and walk in right relation with all peoples on Turtle Island. May we be connected to the heartbeat of the Spirit as one. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that people switch to speaker view on their computers. I have done that for me, just because then when you're speaking, it will be you in the center so that people can focus on your words, and I think it'll be a lot better for everyone around. Now, what I'm going to suggest as we move forward is, Joanne, can you mute everyone except me? And then I will, without hesitation, introduce Zenji Acharya.
John Joseph, can you unmute yourself? Because for some reason I can't unmute you.
Okay, did I unmute me?
No, yes, you did. I'm going to mute myself now, and everybody else should be muted.
Okay, and I'm just going to say, so we're now welcoming Zenji Acharya to come and bring his insight and wisdom.
Okay. Hello. Yes, okay. Amitabha, greetings everyone on behalf of the Buddhist community. First of all, I'd like to thank John Joseph Mastandrea for organizing this conference. He has been a steadfast bridge between the LGBTQ community and the religious community, and he's been a pillar of the interfaith community for over a decade that I've known him. And so I'm proud to call him my friend and my very close colleague in this higher mission of lifting society to a positive consciousness and promoting a sense of empathy and compassion across all communities. I'd also like to congratulate all those who are celebrating the recent verdict of the Supreme Court in the United States, which has made it very clear that there can be no discrimination against employees on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And I think that's an extraordinary step. We've come so far in this battle for gay rights. And I think all of us have to appreciate how far we've come. When I was growing up, there was very limited awareness of gay rights and LGBTQ issues. And so I congratulate all those who have been at the forefront of this very noble movement. We've come so far, and we should always have appreciation for that. In terms of compassion, I'm going to speak on behalf of the Buddhist community and from the Buddhist point of view. In Buddhism, compassion is at the very heart of our religion. But compassion can only be judged or measured when it is in contrast or used for those who are not like us. It is very easy to be compassionate for your friends, your family, people who are in your community. But true compassion is when you can go beyond your own echo chamber, beyond your own group, beyond your own community, and embrace someone who is not like you, the proverbial other. And that is why I spend so much time supporting victims of racism, victims of anti-Semitism, victims of Islamophobia, victims of a callous prison justice system, victims of caste discrimination and untouchability. Now, all of these different categories, for example, they all are subject to prejudice. But sometimes within these categories, there are also members who are of the LGBTQ community. And so they have additional prejudice. There are multiple layers now of prejudice that they have to overcome. So how do you deal with this from a Buddhist point of view? in Buddhism, the Buddha is very, very clear. He says that this entire threefold world is his domain and everyone is his child. So we have a duty to treat everyone like a child of Buddha, regardless of who they are, what lifestyle they embrace. Furthermore, in Buddhism, we believe light conquers darkness. More darkness cannot do that. If we want to conquer hate, we have to approach it from a point of view of love. If we want to overcome bigotry, we have to do it through compassion. If we want to somehow overcome those who are extremely angry, we have to do it from a place of quiet resolve. And that is why, for a person who is from the LGBTQ community, if you are being faced with bigotry, if you are being faced with some sort of oppression, the Buddhist suggestion would be, don't take it lying down, but don't let it bring out your worst, let it bring out your best. In Buddhism, we see, without samsara, there can be no nirvana. Without challenges, there can be no spiritual fulfillment. And therefore, we realize that whenever somebody has a negative attitude or tone, it stems from what's called avidya, or ignorance. So we have to realize that some people are ignorant. They've been conditioned, they've been brainwashed for generations to think a certain way. We have to lead them to the light. We have to escort them to the truth. We have to guide them to a better mindset. Similarly, if somebody is not, for example, some members of the older generation may not be entirely familiar with personal pronouns, for example, the use of personal pronouns. It's very important, again, to have compassion towards them. They're ignorant, to slowly and systematically and gently, yet with quiet, firm resolve, let them know how they should address you. So this compassion concept comes both ways. On the one hand, those who are straight need to continue to embrace members of the LGBTQ community as our friends, our family, with empathy, with compassion, with brotherhood. And those who are in the LGBTQ community and can at times find themselves facing discrimination, they must not let that hate seep into them. They must rise above. They must realize that some people need more time. We've come a very long way, and we will continue to lead them, guide them, educate them, so that we will continue to make extraordinary progress in this very noble mission. So back in the day, they used to say, live and let live, which was a very big mantra. From a Buddhist point of view today, the way we see it, it would be love and let love. And I hope that's the concept. The world needs more love. And if we're going to keep putting terms and conditions on love and how you should love and who you should love, we are simply diminishing the overall love quotient. Let us try and promote that love and that compassion by having empathy for someone's shortcomings and slowly guiding them to strengthen themselves. And that's how we're going to strengthen the entire world. Amitabha.
Thank you, Zenji. Thank you. Remember, write your questions down for the end. And we now come to our wonderful next speaker, who is also a person I call a friend, the Reverend Imam El-Farouk Khaki.
Hey, assalamu alaikum, everybody. You're actually, John Joseph, you are my friend, and you also married me.
Yes, I did. Yes, in 2014.
That's right. John Joseph officiated our legal ceremony, my husband and my legal ceremony. I've been thinking about this question and how to tackle it, particularly in light of what's going on in the world today. And so I begin, as always, with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the tenderly compassionate, the infinitely loving. And a prayer by the Prophet Moses that is quoted in the Quran, that God guides my tongue and makes it easy for me to speak, and so that people can understand my words. I start with the Bismillah, in the name of Allah, the tenderly compassionate, the infinitely loving. I think that is an instruction to anybody who reads the book or recites the verses, to a place of compassion and open-heartedness. That's not to say that's the theory. I'm not saying that's the practice. And I think that's the challenge that we face as people of faith and as queer or queerish people of faith, about the dichotomy between what we may see in text or in the teachings and what we see in practice. In Islam, God is known not by imagery, but through the 99 most beautiful names. And the compassionate, or the most compassionate, is one of those 99 most beautiful names. And God is also the opener of hearts, according to the teachings that we have. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, told us, you cannot be a believer. You cannot be a believer till you love for yourself, till you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself. Sorry, I'll repeat that. You are not a true believer till you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself. So let's take a pause and think about, what is it that we love for ourselves? Health, love, food, etc., etc. And you can't be a true believer till you love that for your neighbor. So peace of mind, stillness of heart, those are the things that most of us wish for. And when we look around the world today, where there are so many people who are hurting and so many people who are afraid, I think it behooves us to look at our teachings and what they tell us, but I think it also behooves us to look at where the gaps are in our teaching, in our actual practices. I think in terms of sort of my practice, I work as a refugee lawyer by day, and in between, and when I'm not doing that, and I'm also the imam of the El-Tawheed Jummah Circle, the Unity Mosque. We're premised on, I really like this expression, justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. It ties really well with the Prophet Muhammad saying that I just sort of quoted. Justice is what love looks like is a quote from Cornel West. And if you don't know Cornel West, you should, because I think it's something that particularly people of European descent should be looking at a time today when we're seeing the rise of Trumpism, and we are witnessing in ways that we have not been able to witness before the depths of racial violence in our backyards. I struggle. I preach a ministry of peace and inclusion, but I am challenged in that by the hate that I have seen recently and the ignorance that I have seen. And so I think as a person of faith, one thing that I've always said is that we should not replicate what our dominant religious communities may have done in the past, whether that is xenophobia or misogyny or racism or shadism or sectarianism, that as people of color, we need to embrace a larger spirituality and a larger sense of acceptance. I think that's the challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, El-Farouk. I think I wrote, your quotes are remarkable. I think this should be on a billboard, definitely, or imprinted in people's hearts and minds. So many thoughts, and then we come to our next speaker. We have Reverend Shawn Newton of the First Unitarian Church. Over to you, Shawn.
Thanks, John Joseph, and thanks for having me here. It's good to be with you and with all of you tonight, and I'm enjoying the conversation so far. When I think about compassion for us, I think very quickly about how Unitarians shift into action. Action is a thing for us. And so I'm thinking in our history, which has been long around queer issues, I will say, it has been about inclusion and relying on two of our core principles, one being respecting and honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and this other, which is a call to radical acceptance of one another. And those have long been pillars of our faith, and it has made it, I will say, relatively easy over the last several decades to be quite inclusive of gay and lesbian people. Bisexual and trans is more of a challenge, but we also are doing our work there. My predecessor, back in the 1960s in this congregation, was approached by the newly formed homophile group in Toronto. And they appealed to him to allow their group to meet in our congregation's building. And the board at the time said no, but he welcomed them into the manse, which was just behind our building once upon a time. And so that began our congregation's history around being inclusive and inviting of queer people in that expression back in the 60s. And that's pretty much continued. Our movement made proclamations around honoring queer people back in the late 60s and early 70s. We've had queer clergy for 50 years. I am not the first gay man to be a minister of the congregation I serve. But though there are still learning curves for us and things that throw us a bit, and ways that we are reflecting at times of how we're not as inclusive as we strive to be. And so I think this practice of, as others have said, trying to practice that love is love, and having this unconditional positive regard for others is a piece of our work. I think part of it also is the way we try to prepare a place for others, that they are not just expected to come in and conform to us, but that we make a space for them to be who they are. For several decades now, we've taught a lifespan religious education approach that looks at human sexuality at 6 different parts of the human life stage, or life stages. And we begin with children when they're 3 and 4 years old, and it goes into late adulthood. But this program invites really candid conversations about sexuality in our congregations. And so sexuality is something that we find pretty easy to discuss. There are basically no questions that can't be asked. And I think that's been an important piece of helping to educate people in our congregation at large, so that we can be more inclusive and compassionate in terms of welcoming people and accepting people. And thinking about allyship as well. And several years ago, I guess almost 20 years ago, my husband and I started attending a Unitarian congregation outside of Boston. We had just moved to the area, and the congregation there had gone through this welcoming congregation process, which is a intensive educational process that a congregation undertakes for a year or so to prepare themselves to announce that they are welcoming to queer people. And this congregation did not have any gay men until we walked through the door, and we got an incredible welcome, almost to the point of being overwhelming. They were really well prepared to do it, but they almost scared us away, frankly. And then something happened. The congregation's newly purchased sign out front, they had spent several $1,000s on, to emblazon that they were a welcoming congregation in big letters with rainbow flags, was vandalized. And they very quickly looked to us as queer people in the congregation to lead the charge of responding and knowing what to do. And I think one of the important things I somehow knew to do at that moment was to invite the straight people in the congregation to be the ones to do the work and responding to the wider community. And bless their hearts, they did that. They repaired the sign. It was vandalized again. And I think that pushed people in the congregation to realize that allyship meant showing up in important ways, and that is a way of showing compassion and shouldering the burden for other people. So I think those are a couple of the pieces for us that have been about actually kind of moving into action and trying to carve out space for people beyond just the principles we profess. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Shawn. It's an interesting bit of enlightenment. I always think of the Unitarian as the most progressive, but obviously we all have our journey, don't we? Definitely. And now we come to Leonard Swartz, that will bring to us, who's become a good friend in the neighborhood, who we've had great, through the multi-faith community. Over to you, Leonard. Leonard, did you unmute yourself? He was there a second ago.
Sorry, John Joseph, I can't seem to unmute anybody.
Okay,
I
Leonard,
can't, but I can't unmute. So.
Leonard, you need to unmute yourself.
How's that?
So you need to turn off one of your sound sources. I think the one on your.
Okay. All right. Bear with me 1 second.
Okay, so Leonard, your phone was working pretty good. You wanted to use your phone or your computer?
Yeah. Maybe my computer.
Okay, so what you need to do is turn off your phone.
Oh, okay. How's that? Okay. Sorry, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Let's just hear you talk a bit. Your sound was better on your phone. Leonard?
Yes.
So Leonard, your
Yeah.
sound.
Unfortunately, I can't use both my the audio and visual.
So why don't we have you turn off your
Yes.
video for now, and just go to your audio.
Hold on 1 second.
Okay. Okay, we can't hear you now. Your visual's okay. I think you've turned off your audio on your computer. You might want to try your audio on your phone. Try that again, because that was working pretty good before. Let's try that. No, we can't hear you. So you need to log back into your phone. You're phoning that. What's the number on the phone? Did he unmute himself? I'm trying to figure out which number it is. Oh, here we are. Oh, I think you have your, there. Talk now, Leonard.
Hello? Hello?
There you go. Okay, you were on mute for some reason. Okay, so
okay.
we're further along. We're all becoming NASA technologists, aren't we? It's quite wonderful in this Zoom age. Who knew? Okay, so what we need to do, because, I think probably because, I wonder if there's a way to make your screen bigger, but we won't worry about that right now. Okay, so unfortunately, because of the way it's audio focused, Leonard is in the top corner. So we're not going to see a big Leonard. We just have to sort of focus about the size of a postage stamp. And then, but the good thing is we can hear his audio. So over to you, Leonard.
Thanks. Sorry about that. So thanks again, John Joseph, for organizing this discussion. And gratitude too goes to the Manor Road United Church. My name is Leonard Swartz, and I was born in Oshawa, currently living in Toronto's downtown east, where I'm known as the Rabbi of Regent Park.
There you go.
I'm a member of the congregation called Shir Libenu, one of Toronto's first LGBTQ communities and synagogues. In the Jewish community, I'm known to be proud, loud, and well endowed with a richness with which many of us are blessed here in Canada, in terms of the social, medical, political, spiritual, and other life-sustaining resources. that we enjoy. Of course, we're painfully aware that many in our community do not have access to even the most basic needs. And there are certainly many opportunities for opening our hearts and expressing our compassion. As a quick intro, I want to brag a bit about what I feel are uniquely Jewish gifts to the history of queer rights. For starters, the modern age of queer culture may be considered as having been born in Germany and thriving there in the 20s and 30s of last century. The homosexual rights movement was advanced by progressive doctors and psychiatrists and lawyers, many of whom were Jewish, such as the famous physician Magnus Hirschfeld. One of his famous quotes, if I may, "The woman who needs to be liberated most is the woman in every man, and the man who needs to be liberated most is the man in every woman." Jews were also very influential in the blossoming of gay rights in the US. One of the first openly gay politicians in the States was a San Francisco city councilor named Harvey Milk, a Jewish politician who opened the door for gays and lesbians in championing their civil rights and envisioning comprehensive human rights in areas like education, public transportation, childcare, and affordable housing. During his time, the world's first gay synagogue, called Beth Hadash Chaim, House of New Life, the congregation was established in 72. One of Harvey's great quotes was, "If you are not personally free to be yourself in that most important of all human activities, the expression of love, then life itself loses." Jews, too, have been involved in the promotion of international gay rights. The second World Pride Parade and Convention was held in Israel in August 2006. I personally have been to gay bars and LGBTQ community centers in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and I found them to be havens of acceptance for both Israeli Jews and Arabs, not to mention that the guys are gorgeous, but that's another story. All of these achievements, and many more continuing to this day, are concrete actions which make sure that, in the words of a famous rabbi, we do not become accomplices of the repressive patterns of our culture, patterns that should be broken and discarded on the junk heap of civilization. However, some religious Jews see LGBTQT activities as running contrary to sections of the book of Leviticus in the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. One section has been particularly problematic, chapter 18, verse 22, which reads, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." I remember hearing a rabbi speaking at the Holy Blossom Temple here in Toronto in a symposium on gay rights about 30 years ago. In one hand, he held the Bible, and in the other, a pair of scissors. And he said, "Some of these passages have got to go." It's also in Leviticus, in the very next chapter, chapter 19, where we read, "Love your neighbor as yourself." There's a whole list of laws, actually, discussing how to live holy lives, from honoring our parents to loving people who are different from us, treating people with justice and mercy, caring for the poor, being honest, having respect for elders, etc. But it's not enough just to learn. What's more important is using the knowledge, putting it into practice. Otherwise, it's just an exercise in self-indulgence. A famous rabbi from about 2100 years ago, Rabbi Hillel, wrote a few phrases that expound on that law of loving one's neighbor. He wrote, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" To be for yourself is important, to take care of our own health, and to make up our minds that certain rituals simply must be done. Exercising and eating right, remaining fit and sane in order that we can help others. Rabbi Hillel also wrote, "If I am only for myself, what am I?" Jewish oral tradition teaches us that the true purpose of our lives is not happiness, but worthiness. To be good, to do charitable works, to respond to the needs of our gay brothers and sisters, and all of us in between. These actions, in fact, do not necessarily take conscious will or compassion. These are obligations. Things we must do. To go to the next level, we have to have and seek compassion. That's what motivates us to break through and make connections and receive what we call nachas, the joy of the soul. Compassion in Webster's English means to suffer together, to feel empathy, to walk in another's shoes, and to recognize our interdependence. Only then are we motivated to bring healing, real reform for the queer community, for the Black Lives Matter movement, for the rights of Indigenous peoples and climate justice, to look in someone's eyes and to see their soul. It's not easy. It means bearing our own. Questioning, admitting our own passions before we become community passionate. Maybe confronting what we think we know about ourselves through trials and tribulations, becoming what we call in Hebrew a bashert, a soulmate, who can heal the world, or tikkun olam. But it's easier if we keep in mind that we are all created in the divine image, that we are all one in the family of humankind, and recognize that in each other, humans who are similar to ourselves. Finally, Rabbi Hillel wrote, "If not now, when?" As Reverend Neo mentioned, today's U.S. Supreme Court ruling that found that workplace laws must protect gays and transgender employees. We should celebrate. Finally, a bit of good news for our neighbors to the south. And in these times of COVID, Jewish leaders have said it's a time for traditional values like chesed v'rachamim, kindness and compassion, to shine through. In some ways, it seems we only learn through trauma, through crisis. And these times of isolation provide a unique opportunity for self-reflection, looking in the mirror and asking ourselves those tough questions. We can't rest on our laurels, though. The work is heavy and the pay is meager. It's not ours to finish the job, but we must make progress for our name's sake. And if I may, a final quick joke about Jewish mothers. A Jewish mom takes her kids to the beach. They're playing in the sand when suddenly a massive wave comes and swallows her smallest child, a little boy, pulling him into the sea. Panicked, she prays to God, "Oh God, please bring him back. Please let him live." Miraculously, an even bigger wave comes, bursts out of the ocean, and deposits her little boy right to her feet. The mom scoops up her little child and hugs him very tightly, and she looks up wistfully into the heavens above and says, "He was wearing a hat." And on that note, thank you for listening. Hope you heard me okay. And hopefully we can exchange emails through John Joseph if anyone has any questions for me or for any of the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leonard. Thank you, Leonard. Very insightful. Very insightful. And now we have our next speaker, the Reverend Dr. Charles Fensham, who is a professor at Knox College in the University of Toronto. Over to you, Charles. Now we have to unpin Leonard. Anybody know how to unpin Leonard? Oh, here we are. Cancel spotlight video. We do that. Hold on. Okay, and then over to Charles. Okay, and then
I have no sound.
oh, we can hear you. Oh, I wonder what happened. We can hear you.
John Joseph, I have no sound. I will have to maybe sign out and sign back in.
Okay, we can hear you.
I've lost sound completely.
Oh, wonder why. That's weird. Okay. What? Hold on. He's not muted. That's really strange. Okay. Okay. Okay, so he'll come back in. Well, why don't we pause there for a second, and we wait for Charles to come back in. I think we're doing pretty good for our audio technical wonders, and thank you, Kathleen, who suggested pinning Leonard. I think that worked out. Now, who actually did that? Because I certainly didn't touch that. Did someone else do? Oh, that was Joanne. Okay, thank you, Joanne. Okay, here we are. Charles is coming back in. Okay, that's interesting. We could hear Charles, but he couldn't hear us. I wonder why. That's really bizarre. Is that Charles there?
Yes, I'm back. John Joseph, I lost sound completely, although the video kept running.
Oh yeah, we could hear you. That's interesting. Okay, well, Charles, I'm glad you made it back in. Wonderful. Okay, well, over to you, Charles.
First of all, my apologies now to Leonard, because I missed about half of what you had to say, and I would have really loved to hear that, but I'll have to watch the recording afterwards.
I think as Leonard suggested, maybe this is we've just opened the doorway to a lot more conversations. Yes.
Well, glad to hear that.
Yes.
So first of all, I'd like to say that, when I speak, in a sense, I can only speak for myself. And as I will say later, Christianity has a really bad history with LGBTQ people in general. And probably when we want to talk about the hearts of compassion, we need to start there. We need to start about talking about that particular element. So I will be speaking about my own view as a gay man who is an ordained minister and a professor at University of Toronto in theology. And I was motivated by, when I studied the Christian history of mistreatment of LGBTQ people, that I was motivated to write a book and to try and make that clear so that we can start there by confession, because that is part of our Christian tradition. So there are three foundational documents of Christian faith called the Gospels, and particularly the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the Christian Bible. And Jesus is recorded in these three Gospels with a message of justice and love. And I think you will hear some of the connections with what other people have shared so far. The connection between compassion, justice, and love also lies very deep in the Christian tradition. And we get that from Judaism. So it's very important to recognize that. And I don't mean that in a supersessionist way, but it's a shared history that we have. And part of our thinking about these ideas of justice and love is where we fail to live up to these ideals of justice and love, then we need to turn away from that failure and turn towards a new path. Christians traditionally call that repentance. And I think the in the Gospel of Matthew, the heart of this idea of repentance is beautifully recorded in Jesus citing words from the Torah. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. And so Jesus didn't end there. He went on. This is from the book of Deuteronomy. He went on and back to Leviticus, a text that Leonard also cited from Leviticus, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And he combined these two very strong traditions and said that all laws depend on these two core ideas, these two core laws, that everything hangs on the love of God and your neighbor as yourself. It's kind of the norm that norms all norms in the tradition. And so this core tradition is what I believe Christianity has often failed to live out in its relationship with LGBTQ people, and where we need to start when we talk about that. For centuries, Christians have done the opposite of loving God and neighbor as self. And this manifested in the most horrible treatment of LGBTQ people, including persecution, murder, torture, bullying. That is totally shocking. Things were done to people. They were burned alive. Their genitals were cut off. They were marched naked down the street. They were hung upside down until they died. The brutality of Christian action towards LGBTQ people in history is just absolutely stunning. And it's not just one particular tradition, but different Christian traditions, including my own Protestant tradition. For instance, in 17th century Holland, boys as young as 16 years old were held underwater in barrels of water until they drowned. So this is an unspeakable history and an unspeakable shame that hangs over Christian tradition. And it needs to be acknowledged before we can start talking about compassion and care and justice. We need to start by confessing this. And this history has not stopped. This history continues. There are some wonderful traditions in Christianity where there is affirmation and welcome, but there are a large majority of Christian traditions still don't act in that way and behave in that way, and the bullying still continues. Even recently, the Department of Social Work at the University of Toronto has been doing research in religious schools in Toronto, mainly Christian religious schools, and they have documented the level of bullying that still goes on with LGBTQ youth in our own city. So there is a history of what the British Cambridge historian Alexandra Walsham calls a history of charitable hatred. It's an exercise of hatred in the name of charity and love. And this is heartbreaking and painful. In a time when I served as a Presbyterian minister in a congregation, I dealt with suicides of LGBTQ people who were driven to a point of despair by what they encountered in their church communities. So this is why I feel very strongly about speaking up about how this misses the very core of the teaching of Jesus. The very core of the love of God and neighbor is missed in these kinds of behaviors. And I guess the beginning of compassion and love is acknowledgement of the reality of the history and the reality that continues on. And in some ways, the whole Black Lives Matter movement at the moment, and voices like the big march, I think yesterday, around queer Black lives and particularly trans Black lives, the intersection of these things remains very, very important as we think about all these different traditions. And so I just want to thank my colleagues from different traditions for inspiring and sharing such important ideas with me as well and I hope we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, everyone. Now, what I'm going to suggest, I always want to honor time. We have about 10 minutes left to the hour. If we can then go into the chat, and I see Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, you want to type your question in the chat? That'd be a great way to, can you see the chat, everyone? Can you see the chat? Because some people aren't as familiar with the chat as others. Not seeing. Oh, was that Ann Piper? Oh, that's Ann Piper. Okay, my own parishioner. Okay, there we go. And so, do you want to type your question? Do you have access to the chat, Ann?
John Joseph, I'm on my phone, so it's going to take me forever with one finger to type.
Okay, so why don't we just go make it easy? Just ask here. So, Ann, you
Can I just say it real quick? I just wanted to say thank you all for doing this. Over the course of my experience in the United Church of Canada, I've lived through the discussion as to whether we should ordain gays and lesbians to our ministry. I've lived through the inclusive language debates, where I finally feel like a full member of our church as a woman. And I've also lived through the whole, shall we become an affirming community? And what I have found through all of those things is that ignorance, and I mean that in the way of lack of knowledge, ignorance has been the main stumbling block in every one of those things. And I think it continues today. So what I'm wondering is if perhaps as groups, faith groups around our community, if we could possibly brainstorm on some of the best ways to educate our congregants on, just what it means and how diverse our population is, and how just the fact of any two people being in a room together, there's diversity. And I think that that's the piece that's missing is the education.
So, Anne, would you like to address that to the whole panel or an individual?
Everybody, whoever wants to speak to it.
Okay, so we'll open that up to the whole panel, and maybe if you want to each weigh in on that, that would be a good. So we don't. I think was bear with me. We'll start with. I think Zenji, do you have an insight for that? Oh, is Zenji still there?
Yes, he'll need to unmute.
So Zenji, you need to unmute.
Yeah. Well, I totally really appreciate your question. I think what's very important is to ensure that there's communication both ways. In my particular case, for example, I'm very, very close to the LGBTQ plus community, but I'm not necessarily a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So I always encourage dialogue. I encourage, I want to hear you, I want to listen to you, where you're coming from. And it's the same thing in any case. I remember I gave a speech once at John Joseph Mastandrea's church when he was at the older church. And at the end of it, this beautiful lady came up to me with tears in her eyes. She's from an Asian background, and she was crying because she was a lesbian, and unfortunately she was not being accepted by her parents, her family. And she thought that if I were to talk to her family, an Asian family, they would take me seriously and then they would accept her. So the fact that she could talk to me, the fact that people can talk to JJ, talk to all of you, the fact that they can communicate, we need to have members of the actual community, the actual faith communities who are of the LGBTQ, communities to speak up and to have their voices heard. And I'm very confident that all of the faith leaders, will amplify those voices, and you will be able to tell your stories, and you will be able to seek the support that you so desperately deserve.
Thank you. And how about we have then Reverend Imam El-Farouk? Can you unmute yourself?
I think it's really important. I think inclusive language, for example, where everybody, or the kind of a space or community where everybody feels affirmed and held in their own experience, I think is extremely important. So, for example, as a practical thing within our mosque community and our liturgy, we will refer to God in a multiplicity of genders. In our written materials, we usually tend to use she pronouns for God. We don't feminize the word. We just use God or Allah in Arabic, but we have an etiquette where we remind people about inclusive language. So, for example, many Muslims have a tendency to say things like brothers and sisters, and but then that leaves out non-binary folk or agender folk. So I think words have power, and words are important, and they're also reflective, I think, of attitudes and mentalities. So sometimes you have to change the words in order to change some mentalities, and I think and sometimes words change because our mentalities are changing as well. But sometimes they go hand in hand, and I think we all need to be conscious. And I think what we are witnessing, and I said this earlier when I spoke, I don't think what we're seeing in the world today is new. I think that the world, we have technology that allows us to be witness in ways that we were not able to be witness before. And the world needed maybe to be still in order for us to hear and to see what is actually going on out there. The killing of the femicide of female bodies, racial violence, particularly anti-Black violence, and the assassination of Black bodies in the United States and Canada, and Indigenous bodies, is not new, but it requires a particular stillness, and it requires a particular awareness in order to contextualize all of it. And so one of the things that's been coming out in my ministry and in dealing with people's fears, especially with what's going on, is that maybe the stillness in the world out there allows us to better look in the mirror, and to look within as well, and also to look and see what's happening in the world. Again, words are very powerful. So what we say is powerful, and what we don't say is also powerful.
Thank you. And may we hear also from Reverend Shawn Newton.
Hi, Anne-Marie, thank you for your question. And two things occur to me, and they speak a bit to the intersectionality question that was raised earlier, which I didn't really speak to before. But I think there's this piece for humility in all of this that I think is really necessary for us to have the practices, the spiritual practices, to decenter ourselves enough to make space for the other, the things that are different from us, so that we can encounter those with a holy curiosity about it. Feels really important. And if we are in a place where we only believe our way of being in the world, whatever mix of identities we carry is normative, then I think that makes it really hard to behold the other and all the splendor that they carry through the world. And so I think that's a key piece. Is education's part of that, but it also, I think, is there's this humbling, and almost all of our traditions have practices that help us to do that. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Shawn. And also, Leonard, can we hear from you? Leonard? I see his phone. I think is that his phone? Unmute. Oh, we have to okay, Leonard, I unmuted your phone.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you now, yes.
Thanks. I was going to recount the story of when I was speaking with a rabbi a number of years ago, and she was describing how she attended many community events with her congregants, but often she would get direction or instructions that didn't sit well with her. For example, she would come to a wedding and the bride's family would say, for example, "Oh, Rabbi, please, we want you to sit at our table, but make sure you sit on this side because we don't talk to that part of the family because Uncle Joe did something bad to us at one time. So, but sit at our table." Or other times she would attend other functions, a bris, for example, a circumcision. And the family would say, "Oh, Rabbi, you're so welcome to join us, and we'd like to hear from you. But please, if you don't mind, don't talk to the side of the family over there, because Aunt Flo and we don't get along because she had a dispute with our family." Anyway, the rabbi said, "How can we tackle the big problems of the day, like peace in the Middle East, when we can't even find peace in our own families?" And I've always been dismayed talking to people who, for example, say they never vote, because diversity exists with just two people. There's politics even when you have just two people in a room. And we have to appreciate and really get into the mindset of other people. And it's not easy. It's easy to yell and scream and shout and be demanding and be stuck in our own mindsets. But to appreciate that we're all flesh and blood, and just a simple word, as Farouk said, and the words we use are very powerful. And if we emphasize those words, or crack a joke or something, and try to extend a branch of peace, even being flexible enough to suppress our own maybe natural instincts to argue or yell, and to listen and find that common ground over time, I think is what builds allies and builds a connection, and then it's much harder to yell or to hurt or to oppose. I'm not sure if that answers the question directly, but
Thank you.
But that's my view.
Thank you, Leonard. And finally, can we hear from Charles?
Well, thank you, Anne-Marie, for your question, and also for the comments that others have offered. If I could add to that, one of the big puzzles that I've been struggling with over the last, must be, I guess, since around 1988, has been advocacy within the Presbyterian Church, my own church denomination for LGBTQ people. And it was a very slow process, and it was many steps backwards before there were steps forward. But the thing that seemed to have really helped with educating people and touching hearts and minds really goes down to personal relationship. It goes to connecting with a human being who happens to be gay or lesbian or trans, and then discovering, oh, they're not all that different. Maybe I can learn something from them and things like that. So a lot of the education piece has to do with that relational dimension and the relationships that we build, and those of us who are doing advocacy and those who are allies, how they can help us evoke compassion through that connection, personal connection that people build with each other.
Thank you, Charles. And just we've come to the hour, and just I want to thank everyone who attended. And it sounds like if you just email me, maybe we continue to expand the discussion further. But just to close, in the words of Harvey Milk, all young people, regardless of sexual orientation or identity, deserve a safe and supportive environment in which to achieve their full potential. Thank you. Shalom, salam, and namaste to all who attended tonight. Blessings be upon you.
Amen.
Amen. Happy Pride, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Good night.